We begin this evening's broadcast with the administration's latest move to ramp up the trade war.
President Trump is imposing new tariffs. He says copper imports will soon face a 50% levy.
Millionaires are made in moments like these, especially if we know when to be greedy and when to be fearful. That's the best way to get rich without getting lucky. And in this video, I'll show you everything you need to know about President Trump's latest tariffs, the big beautiful bill, and which stocks could win big as a result. Your time is valuable, so let's get right into it. First things first, I'm not here to waste your time, so here's everything I'm going to cover. President Trump's new 50% tariff on copper, his new 25% tariffs on Japan and South Korea, the big beautiful bill's tax credits for chip companies, and of course, which stocks I'm buying as a result. With so many huge new policies affecting the same stocks at the same time, I think this is a once-in-a-lifetime investing opportunity. So let's walk through it all together. Earlier this week, President Trump announced plans to impose a 50% tariff on imported copper, which sent copper prices to an all-time high. The US is the world's 5th biggest copper producer, only behind Chile, Peru, Congo, and China. But in 2024, we still imported around 40% of the total copper we consumed. Copper is heavily used across the entire semiconductor industry, not just in the chips themselves, but in the machines making them, the networks connecting them, and the systems that cool them. So the goal of these tariffs is to boost copper mining, production, and processing in the US so that we don't need to rely so much on other countries for this critical computing resource. President Trump also sent letters to the leaders of 14 countries detailing another round of reciprocal tariffs, including 25% tariffs on Japan and South Korea. In addition to copper, the semiconductor industry uses a lot of specialized materials, components, and equipment from both Japan and South Korea. Japanese companies like Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, and Sony make parts for photolithography machines, raw materials and chemicals used in etching and deposition for silicon wafers, and the camera modules and sensors for tons of electronics. And Korean companies like Samsung and SK Hynix make more than half of the world's DRAM and flash memory combined, not to mention processors, microcontrollers, and all of the end products that Samsung ships around the world. And just like with copper, the Trump administration's goals for these tariffs is to move more high-tech manufacturing to the US, especially for memory chips, advanced materials, and semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So taken together, all these tariffs will send serious shockwaves through the entire semiconductor industry, which is bad news for chip manufacturers like TSMC, Intel, and Micron, chip designers like nvidia, Broadcom, and AMD, and major chip consumers like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Apple. But the good news is there's no way these tariffs will stick around in the first place. Like I said in previous videos, these extreme announcements from the Trump administration are negotiating tactics, not US economic policy. That's why they're always so aggressive, and they target industries that are too difficult to relocate in the first place. For example, it takes an average of 29 years for a copper mine in the US to go from discovery to production. That means if we found a rich copper deposit today, it wouldn't start adding new copper to the market until 2054. And since the copper industry can't just magically move to the US overnight, there are only 3 possible outcomes here. Copper companies either absorb these new 50% tariffs by lowering their margins, they pass these new added costs on to their consumers, or the countries they're in renegotiate new trade deals to get these tariffs lowered, delayed, or removed altogether. And the same is true for Japanese and South Korean companies in the semiconductor supply chain. Option 1 won't happen, because we know that companies won't just take a huge cut to their profit margins and do nothing about it. Option 2 won't happen either, because higher copper and higher chip prices directly lead to more inflation, which President Trump can't support if he ever wants to see lower interest rates. And that just leaves option 3, which is these tariffs will get lowered, delayed, or removed completely. And that means much more upside for chip stocks than we previously expected. But to figure out which stocks have the most upside, we need to look at one more thing, and that's the big beautiful bill. By the way, one thing I always get asked about is my research process, and how I can cover so many stocks when so many news sources use clickbait headlines and put a spin on the truth. My secret weapon is a platform called Ground News. Ground News analyzes over 60,000 articles every day and rates each news source for political bias and factuality. For example, check out this story about Tesla's first driverless delivery in Austin. Right away, we can see 93 sources reporting on this story, with twice as much coverage from the left versus the right. And while most of them have a high factuality rating, there's some very clear bias here. Headlines from left-leaning sources show much more skepticism, questioning Tesla's achievement and framing it as a publicity stunt, while sources on the right are celebrating it as a major milestone. And their blind spot feed shows me which stories are being ignored by one side or the other. Knowing what isn't being talked about is just as important as what is. These features save me a ton of time while keeping my facts straight and my research unbiased. And right now, Ground News is giving my audience 40% off their Vantage plan. That's their biggest discount yet. So go to ground.news/TSY or click my link in the description to get unlimited access to every Ground News feature for just $5 a month. And a big thank you to Ground News for supporting the channel and making the media more transparent. Alright, so chip stocks are set to win big if these newly announced tariffs on Japan, South Korea, and copper imports don't stick. But the biggest winners are the stocks that also benefit from the Big Beautiful Bill, which includes the most significant semiconductor manufacturing incentives since the CHIPS Act itself. The latest version of President Trump's Big Beautiful Bill, which was passed by the Senate this past Tuesday, increases tax credits from 25% to 35% for companies that expand their advanced chip manufacturing in the US by the end of 2026. A 40% increase in the tax credit rate for building new fabrication facilities dramatically improves the economics of these multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investments. There are two important details in this part of Trump's Big Beautiful Bill. First, the tax credits are uncapped, which means there's no maximum dollar amount that a company can claim. And second, companies can make a direct pay election, which gives them the credit as an upfront cash payment from the Treasury instead of a tax reduction. These two features together essentially mean that the US government is giving chip companies a 35% cash rebate on their chip production investments in the US without any limits. Companies like Intel, TSMC, and Micron have already committed over $100 billion worth of investments each, which means the Treasury would be giving them anywhere from $35 to $60 billion apiece, making this one of the biggest direct incentives the US government has ever given to private companies. So, between the provisions in the Big Beautiful Bill, the proposed 50% tariffs on copper probably getting reversed, and the incoming 25% tariffs on Japan and South Korea probably getting lowered, here are the stocks that I think will benefit the most. Let's start with Applied Materials, ticker symbol AMAT. Jensen Huang made it clear that NVIDIA's GPUs and accelerated computing in general would not exist without Applied Materials. Applied Materials revolutionized the semiconductor industry by inventing fundamental chip processing tools. For example, they make machines called epitaxial reactors, which apply different layers of materials onto semiconductors to change their electrical properties, like making certain areas more or less conductive before it becomes a memory device or a microprocessor. AMAT also makes chemical mechanical polishers, or CMPs, which use a special solution to smooth the layers applied by the epi reactor. Polishing these layers helps them fit together without any gaps or electrical issues. Once all the layers have been added to the wafer by the reactor and polished by the CMP, it's considered a planarized wafer, and it's ready for the next processing step, which is etching and deposition. At a high level, etching is where the tiny channels are carved into each layer of the wafer. The pattern these channels create is determined by the design of the circuit, which comes from chip designers like nvidia and AMD. After etching, the deposition process is where a conductive metal is deposited into those channels, turning the planarized wafer into an electronic circuit. Applied Materials makes many more machines for a wide variety of industries, but I wanted to highlight a few of the big ones for chip design, since they all use specialty parts and subassemblies from the Japanese and Korean companies that I mentioned earlier, making them very sensitive to these latest tariff announcements. Today, Applied Materials trades at a 21 forward price to earnings ratio, which is much lower than companies like Lam Research and NXP Semi, and their trailing 12-month PE ratio makes them pretty cheap compared to the rest of the semiconductor industry. AMAT stock is currently up by around 20% year to date, and I think they have a lot of room to run over the course of the AI era, especially if these latest tariffs get lowered or canceled altogether. One of Applied Materials' industry peers is Micron Technology, ticker symbol MU. Even though the stock is up by around 40% year to date, I still think it's pretty cheap. Let me explain why. First, it literally is cheap, trading at a forward price to earnings ratio of just 12.3, which is much cheaper than its closest peers, while their earnings are expected to grow much faster. And just like AMAT, Micron stock is also much cheaper than the chip industry average based on their trailing 12 months of earnings. Second, Micron technology makes memory for the entire computing industry, including solid-state drives, RAM modules, and flash memory for data centers, consumer PCs, smartphones, and even cars. All these markets will transition to more advanced memory as they integrate more AI applications into their products and services, from co-pilots on computers and smartphones to better AI models in robots and self-driving cars. As a result, the market for high bandwidth memory is expected to more than 6x in size over the next 8 years, which would be a 25% compound annual growth rate through 2033. The reason I think every industry will adopt high bandwidth memory is it packs a lot more memory into the same area by stacking memory chips and connecting them to a shared hub. That lowers the physical distance that the data needs to travel, which lowers power consumption and increases data transfer speeds. And third, Micron makes high bandwidth memory chips for NVIDIA's Hopper, Blackwell, and Blackwell Ultras, as well as AMD's Instinct MI325, MI350, and MI355X accelerators. And Micron's two biggest competitors are Samsung and SK Hynix, both of which are South Korean companies facing these new tariffs. Whether or not the Trump administration ends up reducing or delaying these tariffs, I think that chip companies will diversify their memory supply chains in Micron's favor, since they're an American company headquartered in Idaho. On top of that, they're building a $15 billion DRAM fabrication and packaging facility in Idaho and a $100 billion mega fab in New York, which could qualify them for over $37 billion from the Big Beautiful Bill and push their already high gross margins of 39% even higher. Don't sleep on Micron, the only major American company in the high bandwidth memory market. And if you feel I've earned it, don't sleep on the like button and subscribe to the channel. That really helps me out and it lets me know to make more content like this. Thanks, and with that out of the way, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and that's TSMC. As you probably know, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company sits at the heart of the entire AI revolution. TSMC is a pure-play foundry that builds chips for other companies without making any chips for themselves, which means they don't compete with any of their clients, unlike Intel, for example. As a result, TSMC makes around 90% of all advanced chips in the world, from the chips inside Apple's iPhones and MacBooks all the way to NVIDIA's data center GPUs. The global AI chip market is expected to almost 9x in size over the next 8 years, which would be a compound annual growth rate of over 31% through 2033. But like I've been saying for years now, I expect their share of the AI chip market to grow over time, not stay the same. In fact, right as I was recording this video, TSMC released their revenue report for June 2025, where they showed a 40% increase in Q1 and 2 combined revenue versus the first half of last year. That makes TSMC an almost trillion-dollar company with 40% year-over-year revenue growth. So just because a company is big doesn't mean it can't keep growing. It doesn't even mean that it's expensive. TSM stock trades at a forward price-to-earnings ratio of just 18, much lower than its peers, and that's with a projected earnings growth of just 14%. But their earnings per share actually grew by 60% year over year in Q1, or over 4 times higher than last year's average analyst estimates. Just to be clear, this big miss by Wall Street analysts is why it's so important to understand the science behind the stocks. This is why I tend to trust discounted cash flow models more than industry analysts, which calculate TSM stock's fair value to be around $307 per share, making it 25% undervalued today. Said another way, TSM stock would have to go up by 33% just to hit their fair value now. That's a 33% upside on one of the most important AI companies on Earth, and that's before accounting for the 50% tariffs on copper, which I don't think will stick, the 25% tariffs on parts coming from Japan and South Korea, which I expect to be reduced, or the tens of billions of dollars in extra tax credits that TSMC will receive thanks to the updated language in the latest version of the Big Beautiful Bill. So hopefully this episode helped you understand some of the Trump administration's latest big announcements, the way they could impact the AI and semiconductor landscape, and a few great stocks that could win big as a result. And if you want to see even more great stocks that I think will win big, make sure to check out this video next. Either way, thanks for watching, and until next time, this is ticker symbol U. My name is Alex, reminding you that the best investment you can make is in you.